Hello, YouTube. This is Umozo3. So now we're on to lesson 22, which is our introduction of our discussion of object-oriented programming. This idea that we can essentially create our own data types in Java. We've already seen a couple of data types. We've seen some primitive data types, which are int, double, boolean, and character. We've also seen a couple of other classes in Java. So we've talked about the string class. We talked about string methods in lessons 5 and 6. We talked about the scanner class in, what was that, like lesson 18, I think. And then we also talked about the math class in lesson 19. So there are some classes that Java provides that are going to be essentially helpful for us to be viewing. So what I want to do here, I'm going to show you guys that you can create your own classes. So we talked in the last two lessons about how we can move some of our programming out of the main method and we can build our own functions. And so, we can do that. We can basically build our own static methods. So I would encourage you to go back to lessons 19 and 20 if you need a refresher on what static methods are and how we can create our own functions. But more so even than that, we can actually create our own classes. So this whole time we've been working in a hello world class. So what classes allow us to do in Java is basically create data types or create object types that are familiar to us and that are going to store information that we think is going to be helpful in the execution of our program. So let me show you what I mean by that. What we're going to do is we're going to create a new class. So I'm just going to press new class here at the top, and I'm just going to go ahead and call it a person class. So I'm going to go ahead and insert that person class here, and we can go ahead and double click it. And just like we did in lesson 1, I'm going to go ahead and delete what's inside in the middle here. But these are actually the code that you see in here is getting closer to the code that we're going to be able to produce and understand by the end of this video, because what we need to do is think about the components that we need in a particular class. So in lessons 19 and 20, we moved out of the main method and built our own static methods. In lesson 21, we move out of the hello world class and build our own classes. This allows us to create objects of particular customized types. Okay, so basically every object will have two properties or special aspects that define its personality. So every class is going to have basically parameters or fields. So for example, a person would have a name and an age, okay? And those properties can have primitive data types. So for example, if you're going to create a person object, if you're going to create a person class, you could say that a person object is going to be defined by a string, which represents their name, and an int, which represents their age. So we're going to be seeing that in the example that we do here. And then also classes usually have methods, so functions. So this is basically, functionality that a class provides that is related to that class somehow. So let me show you what I mean by that. So we're gonna do an example in this video where I basically lay out the essential components that every successful and mainstream object-oriented program should have. So we're gonna create a person class, and we need to define what a person object with the parameters and the functions for a person object. So the first thing that we need is we need to declare instance variables. So what we're gonna do here at the top, before we even written any methods or functions, we're going to write private string name and private int age. So this is the declaration of our first instance variable. We haven't initialized it yet. We haven't given this person object a name. We haven't given this person object an age. But what we've done is we said, okay, Java, I'm gonna want you to keep track of a name and an age throughout this program. These are going to be the data types, so declaration of our second instance variable. And in this video, I'll be telling you guys a little bit more about the difference between public and private, because I know we sort of glossed over that in lesson 19, but I want to give it a little bit more of a fair treatment in this video. So now that we've declared our instance variables, we need something called a constructor. A constructor is a special type of method that is responsible for creating an instance of an object. Okay, so what you want to do is you want to think of an object as an instance of a class. So let me give you an example. When we said string x equals tree, so when we created a string object called x and we assigned it to the string tree, right, those 4 letters, basically that's an instance of the string class. So it's a string object. An object is like an example of a class. It's essentially a blueprint of a class. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a constructor, and we're going to say person, and then we're going to say of string n and int a. So if you go back to the lessons 19 and 20, you'll see that this kind of format looks sort of familiar, right? Because when we were talking about static methods, we said that we needed to give it a name. And then in parentheses, we're going to feed in all the inputs, all the parameters that that method was going to take or accept or feed in. And so what we're doing is we're going to feed in, these are 2 parameters. We're going to feed in a string, which we're arbitrarily going to call n, within this inside the definition of this constructor, and an integer which we're going to call a inside the definition of this constructor. And the only thing that our constructor is going to do here is assign the instance variables. So basically, let me tell you what I mean by that. So a constructor is a special type of method that creates an instance of a class, so an object, okay? And so usually it assigns the instance variables for a particular object. So right now you have name and age, and these are very special variables, and different person objects are going to have different values for those 2 instance variables, and they get assigned at the time of creation. So if you're going to create a new person and you want to call them Michael Jackson, and you want to make their age 58, you can do that. So what we would do here is we would mandate that if we're going to create a new person with some string and some int, then we're going to assign their name to the string that they pass in, and we're going to assign their age to the int that they pass in. So it's just going to be name equals n and age equals a. So this is called a constructor, and it's what your program should have. It's a method that's really special, and it's required if you're going to be creating objects. So it's for creating an object. The next type of method that a successful class needs is usually what's called a getter method. So this is where we talk about the difference between public and private, okay? So public, as we said very briefly in lesson 19, means that a class, it means that a method or variable can be accessed from outside of the class it was declared, okay? So you can see a private string name, private int age, but if we want to be able to use name and age directly outside of the class, we would need to make those public variables. But that's not going to be needed, because what we're going to do is set up what's called a getter method and a setter method, and those will allow us to, number 1, access, and number 2, change the values of those instance variables for a particular person object. Okay, so for private, a method, that would be a method or variable that can only be accessed from the class it was declared. So we're going to create a public method that will be able to retrieve the value of this instance variable, because these instance variables are private, so we can't call them from outside of the person class. But we're going to create a public method that we can call from outside of the person class, so that we can access the name and age of a person object from outside of the person class. So now all we need to do is public string get name. And then this is an example of a method. So I encourage you to go back to lessons 19 and 20 when we were talking about methods. The difference here is that you're not going to see them. There's going to be a difference here, because you don't see a static. This is not a static method. So we have instance methods which retrieve properties of a particular object. So like we were saying in lessons 19 or 20, static is like a standalone method. So it does not require the instantiation of an object. So for example, in lesson 19, you might remember we created a function called f. And we said f is going to return an int, and it only accepts one int called x, and it simply adds 4 to that number and returns the result. With these methods, these methods are called instance methods, because you can't just arbitrarily call get name You would call get name on a particular person object. So it requires the instantiation. You wouldn't just get a name. You would be getting a name for a person object that you've already created. So the way that the get name method works is we're simply going to return the value of that name instance variable. That's all there is to it. It's simply a public method that allows us to retrieve information or attributes about a particular object. And so you would have a similar method to in order to retrieve the particular age of a person object, where you would just say return their age. And so these are these are instance, not static methods. And then so these are what's called getter methods, because they allow us to retrieve the value of an instance variable. What if we want to change the value of an instance variable? So what if you're born with the name Harriet and you said, I don't want to be called Harriet, I want to be called Bob? Okay, so what you're going to do is you're going to say public void set name of string n. And in the previous video, we said that void is the return type that you use for a method that is expected not to return anything. If we're going to set the name of a person object, it doesn't mean that we're requesting any information, right? We're not retrieving anything. We're simply performing a task. We're simply modifying one of the parameters of the object. So instead of returning anything, writing return, this is a purple word here that you see in these other two methods, we're simply going to say name equals n. So we're going to reassign the value of the name instance variable to whatever value n the programmer ends up passing in. So you say, you know what, I don't want them to be called Harriet, I want them to be called Bob, okay? And then it's going to say, okay, we'll reassign their name from Harriet, which is what it was at the beginning when you called the constructor, to Bob, which is what it'll be, you know, later on in the program after you call this setter method. And you're going to have another type of setter method for the age, and this time instead of passing in a name, you'd be passing in an int. And it doesn't matter what you call this parameter, you just have to make it consistent. So you could have said age equals x, but if you want to say set age of int banana, then you would just say age equals banana. So now what we do, it's customary to create a tester class. So what we're going to do is we're going to compile this class. So let's think about the components that we have here. We declared two private instance variables without initializing them until we get to the constructor and we create a person object. After we create a person object, we can retrieve information about a person object by calling the getName method or the getAge method on the person object. And we can also set their name or age if we're unhappy with what their values were when the person object was created. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press compile and close. And now it's customary to create a whole separate class to create a main method and test the functionality of the main class that we created. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a person tester class. So now I've created my second class just for this video alone. And the only method that I'm going to have in the person tester class is a main method. So in lesson 1, remember, we created a main method. We've known how to do that ever since the beginning. And here what I'm going to do is I'm going to test the creation of a person. So when you're creating an instance of a class, what you need to do is you need to write the class name. So you're going to say person P, and you can either declare and initialize on separate lines or on the same line. What I think is a little more common is for people to do it on the same line. So what you would do is you create a name for the variable. So you say, okay, I want this person object to just, you know, for as far as Java is concerned, I want it to be called P. And I'm going to say person P equals new person. And then if we look back at the person class, it looks like we need to feed in a name and an age when we're creating a person object. So that's what I'm going to do in my person tester class. I'm going to feed in a string for their name, and I'm going to feed in an integer for their age. And now what I can do is I can use the getter methods, and I can call getter methods on P in order to retrieve details about this person object. So now if I call system.out.println of p.getName, what will I expect? Well, according to the getName method that I wrote here in my person class, if I call getAge on a person object, it should return the value of the age instance variable for that particular object. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to press compile, and I'm going to go ahead and click person tester, and indeed we get that Tammy that we were looking for. What if I want to change her age? What if she has a birthday? Now what I'm going to do is demonstrate to you the use of the set age method, okay? And you can try the set name on your own, but when you call set age, remember with void, you're not setting the output of set name or set age equal to anything. You're simply performing a task, okay? So what you would do is you would say p dot set age of 39, okay? If you want to be really formal about it, if someone has a birthday, you might not know how old they are currently. You just know that their birthday is going to be equal to their current birthday plus 1. So what you would do is you're going to feed in an integer to reassign their age. And what is that integer? Well, it's going to be their current age plus 1. So now, if you say system.out.println of p.getAge, and we go ahead and compile and run this code, remember, you're going to run the main method of the person tester, okay? Because the person tester is what has your sandbox. It's what has your main method. It's really what's testing your person class. So if you run the main method of person tester, what you're going to see is that Tammy, we retrieved Tammy's name, and then we set their age to whatever their current age was plus 1. So it set their age to 38 plus 1, which is 39. And so that's why we retrieve Tammy and 39, okay? And you could do this for another example too. So you can say person x equals new person of John and 44. And then if you say system.out.println of x.getAge, what number would you expect? So here it's going to be returning that 44, because when we defined the person class, we said that if we call the getAge method on a person object, so like p.getAge, without calling any inputs, remember that you can see these two methods have no inputs, it'll just return the respective values of those two instance variables. So that's why if we run the person tester class at this point, we see John's age printed down here, which we defined to be 44 when we created the person object right here. So we said x equals new person of John and 44. So these are the fundamentals of object-oriented programming. Remember, you declare instance variables at the very top. For your constructor, you assign instance variables. For getter methods, you retrieve the values of instance variables. For setter methods, you change the values of instance variables. Okay, typo here. And then finally, you will have a separate tester class with a main method to verify that your class works as intended. And you can define those methods however you want them to be defined. So hopefully that was helpful for you. This is the beginning of object-oriented programming. In the next video, we're going to fill in some of the gaps. I'm going to talk about a few more details, a way that we can have multiple constructors and why we would want to do something like that. So from UMOS03, thanks for watching and please subscribe.